What is that thing anyway? I mean,
It's a camcorder.
movie camera?
Yeah, it's a camcorder. It's like
A what?
it's what you'd make home movies out of.
Oh, yeah.
Camcorder.
Yeah. Yeah, all right. I've known people that would never have personal home movies taken thinking that it could be perverted.
Well, you're already pretty perverted, so I
Yeah.
don't think there's a problem.
In fact, I had a kid once during the commie days that had brought in a tape recorder and was going to tape what's going on in class, and I said, "No, you got to put that away." And he said, "Well, why?" And I pointed out that those kind of things can be monitored and changed,
Sure, of course.
and there was a lot of that going on at that period of time. So,
Well, I mean, now you can do just that with your cell phone, right?
yeah.
You can record anything with your cell phone. I wanted to actually start by asking you. You mentioned that student in the commie days. I mean, that's when you first started teaching. What was that like? I mean, teaching social studies in Portland in the early '60s during the Cold War. I mean, did you feel free to be kind of teaching the issues, or was there a lot of pressure from administration to toe a party line of some kind?
No, there wasn't much in the way of pressure from administration, but Merle Cressy and I both dealt rather severely with the people that were interested in stopping free speech.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, we covered in our classes, the differences between the political systems in this country and in Russia, for example.
Right.
And within that, the idea of free speech was essential. And at that time, we had examples of a few people that had spoken freely and were fired, and especially in
These
schools.
were teachers?
Yeah.
At Sunset or somewhere else?
No, somewhere else. What's the town just up the Columbia River from here? Scappoose High School. We had a teacher at Scappoose that was about like we were, and had invited, for example, that black group that was
The Panthers?
what?
The Black Panthers?
Black Panthers in to speak to his classes, and he was fired because of that. And all they were talking about was the issue of free speech
Right.
in a society. And it wasn't politically oriented any more than that. And we had people from the Black Panthers in, and in fact invited communists in at one point to speak to the kids. And there was no problem.
Were those American communists or from
Yeah,
another
no, American, yeah. I can't remember whether we had Gus Hall in or not. He's the president or the head of the American Communist Party. But
So how was that? I mean, that seems like a big deal, and you just rolled it off the cuff there. I mean, like, how did students react to that? How did parents and administrators and, I mean, what was that like?
the students took it fine, and we introduced it ahead of time, the fact that we were going to have communists speak, and we also had a fascist come in and talk and so forth, and the theme was always free speech, the idea of being able to say what you think.
Mm-hmm.
And so the parents, in large part, didn't like that. Kids liked it, okay. They thought it was good. We had a kid that was later to become the student body president at Portland State University, was drafted. And he gave the military such a hard time when he was going through his physical. They just checked him off as being unfit for the military. And he came to class and was talking about it, and attracted probably half the school coming in at various times of the day to hear him talk. He was a good speaker and funny, and did a lot of things that were designed to stir up the military, but it was still very good as far as the concept of free speech.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I mean, he said that people ought to be able to say what they think.
Right.
Which is right, what it ought to be. We had, we were doing this convention at the time that part of this program was going on, and Merle and I went to the state fair, not the state fair, the county fair in Hillsborough.
Uh-huh.
And the Democratic Party, Republican Party had a booth set up there, and we
Keep going.
and we then we just were there looking around at various things, and there was this booth, so we walked over there, and the woman in charge asked us if we knew Jim Barlow and Merle Cressy. And so we said, yeah, we do. And she said, those are two communists that are working in the Beaverton School District. And we let her talk for a while. And then later we explained that we were Jim Barlow and Merle Cressy.
What was the booth?
Booth was just a thing advertising the Republican Party.
Ah.
There's nothing to do with schools or anything. But
Well, you gained a reputation.
yeah, well, it was sort of pitiful, you know. And then I think probably you're aware of the fact that I was asked by the Parent Teacher Association at Sunset to come to one of their meetings one time.
Right.
And you know, and I asked what was the purpose of that, and they said, well, we want to talk to you about your subversive teaching, etc. So I said, okay, I'll come. And normally the Parent Teachers Association had maybe a dozen people show up to the meeting, and this time they had loaded up the cafeteria. There were probably estimated 300 people there, and so I came. The school district didn't do much in the way of support, by the way, in those days.
Uh-huh.
But I sat at the table like this, and the chairman of the group was on the other side of the table. And I said, okay, now what's the purpose of calling this meeting and inviting me to show up here?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, we think you're a communist, and we would like to see you fired from this position. We don't like to have you teaching in Beaverton School District or Sunset High School. And so I said, okay, well, let me ask you some questions. And by the way, this meeting only lasted 5 to 10 minutes. That was the end of it. I said, well, would you like to have me teach about the American political system? And he said, well, sure, yeah. And would you like to have me teach about American capitalism, the economic system we have? And he said, yes, that we think that would be appropriate. And I said, now, the students don't know anything about it, but most of them don't know much about the Soviet system of government or economic system. Don't you think it'd be good for them to understand that as well, so they could make a comparison? I mean, if the American system of politics and capitalism is good and worthwhile, don't you think the students ought to be able to make comparisons on their own between us and, say, Russia? And he said, well, yeah, that'd be a good idea. And I said, now, added to that, don't you think it would be a good idea for us to make some other comparisons between our system and, say, China and Cuba and Canada and Mexico and Western European countries, etc.? Because, I mean, how can you make a judgment if you only know one side of the story?
Right.
And he said, he thought for a while, and you could hear murmuring going on there in the audience. And he said, yeah, is that what you do? And I said, yeah. And he had enough sense not to just condemn what I was doing, because even though 95% of the people there were very conservative
Right.
and wanted me out, there was some percentage of people, 5-10% of people that came who did not think I should be removed. And so he said, you got a point there. You probably ought to teach both sides of the story. And I said, okay. And at that point, people began talking among themselves, and that was the end of it. He said, okay, meeting adjourned. And that's all there was to it.
What year was this?
But,
What year was this?
oh, it was probably in 1965, maybe.
Yeah.
I'd only been teaching for a year or two.
Yeah.
And that was kind of frightening, to me at the time, because you never knew if that might lead to my getting
Right.
the need to find a new job.
Had you planned out that line of questioning, that line of response before
No.
you sat down?
I didn't know what it was going to be about.
Or you didn't know what the meeting was going to be about?
Right.
So they just said, come to the meeting, we're not going to tell you what it's about?
Yeah, well, I think, maybe they told me they didn't want me teaching anymore, but
But you didn't have that, you didn't sit home with a pen and paper and plan that.
I did not have anything, notes or anything. I didn't think about it beforehand.
Huh. Well, that's a pretty good response. You missed your calling as a lawyer.
Yeah, well, and the interesting thing was, ever after that, and I taught there at the Beaverton School District at Sunset and Aloha for 43 years, something like that. Every year that I was teaching, some kid would come up to me and say, Mr. Barlow, are you a communist? And it shows you how word travels. It gets around to the neighborhood and so on. And, at the time, I didn't know any communists, and, was just completely unaware of anybody in the district or Portland that was a communist or socialist, for that matter.
How did you, two things. One, I think that might be, the rattling of it might be picked up on the mic a little bit. The other thing I was going to ask is, if that's the case, and it's 1965 or whatever it was, how confident did you feel you were in knowing what communism was to teach the kids?
In knowing what it was?
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like getting information about communism was hard to come by, and you weren't meeting I'm just trying to do a comparison to if I was going to teach about some religion, and I'd never met anybody of that religion, and I couldn't, and books about that religion were banned, well, I might not really know much about that religion, so it would be hard to teach kids. Did you feel like you understood communism very well?
Yeah.
Enough to teach
No,
kids?
I knew what it was, and I knew what their economic and political system was. I mean, I'd been teaching it for, a couple of years by then.
Uh-huh.
In my AP classes, that's one of the major parts of it.
Right.
And so, so it was pretty obvious that if you're going to be a legitimate teacher, you had to give all sides of an issue.
Sure.
And so I just pointed that out.
Right.
And the guy that was in charge of the meeting, at least he had a good enough sense to realize that, that does make sense.
Yeah.
But they still thought of me as a communist.
Ever since.
It was pitiful, but,
You mentioned going to the Washington County Fair. with Merle Cressy. How did you meet Merle Cressy? Like,
Oh, just that when I got hired on at Sunset, he was already working there. And so when I became part of the department, in the social science department, that's how we met.
was he much older than you? Or was he similar? Are you guys similar in age?
I was older than him by 2-3 years, something like that.
Is Merle Cressy alive today?
What?
Is he around today?
Yeah.
Yeah.
However, he lives in near Bend.
Ah, okay.
Has a yurt that he had built for $35,000. Been living there ever since.
Does it have electricity?
Of what?
Does it have electricity?
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's a round house,
Yeah.
but it's not a yurt in the sense that they have it up there in Mongolia,
Yeah.
made out of skins or anything. It's made out of timber and wood and so on. And so
When was the last time you saw him?
Oh, probably it's been 1.5 years now.
Oh, okay. So recent, somewhat recently.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, we make contact every now and then, and we talk on the phone occasionally. He's having some difficulty. He can't drive to Portland anymore because his eyesight's giving out on him. So
Sure.
he just drives out there in Bend.
Is he married?
No.
No.
He was married, got a divorce. He reminds me of a welfare client that I had before I went into teaching. I working for welfare in Hillsborough, and on one of my field trips one time, not field trips, home